Glad to have everybody out tonight, and I'm here to try and share some information about DXing on 6 meters and trying to maximize your efforts on working DX on 6 for our smaller and larger stations. I can't tell you everything about it in the time that I've got, and you'll hear a lot of people call 6 meters the magic band, but after you've been on there for a while trying to work DX, it may not seem quite so magic. But you will see some pretty amazing things on 6 meters. Let me have the next slide.
Is that yours?
Yes, this is a 6 meter antenna down in the Caribbean. I forget, let's see, what was this called? I don't remember the call, but it was a VP2 or something like that.
He was on hiring.
He was. He uses that flag everywhere he goes. W9DR is his home call. So one thing, I did some adding up, and if you realize in a year's time, in the last 16 years, 99.5% of the time each year, there is no terrestrial 6 meter DX here in Atlanta. That amounts to maybe 40, 50 hours. This 40 or 50 hours you've got to try to work everything that you want to work every year. And so guys that are working day shift, it's really going to put a bite on you because you've got, the morning hours are great for 6 meters. Give me the next slide, please.
The answer is retire. Right?
Well, exactly, if you can. Okay, here's some of the things we're going to talk about with it in the order of importance for me. Number one is the most important thing in that you've got to know when to be there instead of wasting your time and being there at the wrong time.
Sorry, I'm sorry.
Give me one more slide there. Okay, 6 meters probably has more propagation modes than any other band, and I'm going to talk about just the ones that will get you some DX. Not for VE, not for XE. This is going to Europe, South America, down into deep Caribbean. And next slide, please. If you want to know what makes some of these propagation modes actually tick, K9LA has some real great tutorials on how different propagation modes work on 6 meters. I found his information really good, so you might enjoy that. Now, the first one we'll talk about is F2. Unfortunately, I don't think, if you haven't seen it, you're probably not going to see it. F2 is something we use during our HF days, to make DX contacts. Normally we reflect off of the F2 layer and go to Europe, wherever. But to get F2 on 6 meters, you need extremely high flux numbers. And the last time we had any that high enough was like 2001, 2002. And they're predicting we're not going to see numbers high enough the next 2 cycles. So if you're over 50, then you may not ever see it. Now, of course, predicting this is like predicting the weather. Could be, we don't know. We're just going to have to wait and see. There was 1989 and 2001, 2002 were great years. But like right now, the flux is like 70, and we need something like 250 or 300 over at 6. So we're a long ways. You need to do your low band stuff. I remember in 2000 to 2002, in the mornings you could run 100 Europeans. I mean, just if you just want to work them contest style, just get on in the morning, just work all the Europeans that you wanted to work on CW or whatever. But those days are gone, unfortunately. Let me have next slide. Okay, this is a little something about the flux I was talking about. You can see, if I get my pointer to work. Down here, November 1989, we had about 235. 2001, it was up about 213. And then the last one we just kind of went through was in 2013 and 14. And you can see they were only about half of these numbers. We never got high enough during 2013, 14, that era, to ever get any F2. And you can see, 2008, we were down to about 69. That's about where we're at right now. So we got a long climb to get out. Okay. Okay, these are, and on each one of these, you'll see some of the cards of countries that you'll possibly work on these modes. The one on F2 looked very similar to this, where you're working a lot of Europeans and so forth. And so what they call this is E-skip. And you'll hear people saying sporadic E or E-skip. What happens in the summertime and also in January, we get an E layer that gets ionized enough to use on 6 meters. But the primary time that you're going to work any DX is going to be in the summer E-skip, which is late May to mid-August. And to pin the time down a little bit more, okay, yeah, you can go ahead to that one, I'll go ahead. Yeah, that one. This shows a little something about F2 and E. You notice here F2, the layer is up here around 250 kilometers. So say if you're trying to go to Europe, you're not going to have to make many hops to get to Europe. But if you're trying to do it on E-skip, these layers here are around 100 kilometers. So you can see you're going to have, you know, probably twice or 3 times as many hops. So the signals are much weaker by the time you get to Europe. There's a winter period normally in January, but I've never seen any DX to any degree come up during that E period. So you can see some of the things. Drop back to that E-skip real quick. One more time. One more. Yeah. You can see mostly Europeans. You're going to work a lot of Europeans. You'll work some South America, Africa, that kind of stuff. Okay, you can jump up a couple. You move on up. Okay, there's back one, please. There's a mode. It doesn't happen often, but it can happen. It's called TEP, which is trans-equatorial propagation. And what happens is the signals will jump from, say, here into deep South America. So you can see some of the things you might work is like Ecuador, Brazil, Argentina, the Falklands, stuff like that, stuff down deep, so it's jumping across the equator. That K9LA site, you know, could probably tell you more about how this really works. Now, normally TEP shows up during the equinox, either in the fall or spring equinox, which we're almost at. I think,
Tomorrow afternoon.
is it tomorrow afternoon? Yeah, we're very close. This is the time of year you would maybe kind of be on 6 looking for South Americans. Doesn't mean they're going to be there, but they might be if we had some TEP. And normally, I tend to think it occurs more later in the afternoon, but I can't confirm that. Okay.
That's because you sleep in the morning?
I'm sorry?
That's because you sleep in the morning.
Not during the summer, I don't. I'm up early.
I don't think he sleeps at all.
I don't think he
Yeah, jumping back to E-skip. Normally E-skip will start, it's hard to judge, but you want to be there by 9 anyway in the mornings. And you want to stay till noon or 1 o'clock. And it can open earlier than that. I have seen it open as early as 7, but that's unusual. Normally 8:30, 9 o'clock, you know, somewhere in that area. But It may be up to 10. You can't just say exactly the time, but you do need to be there during the mornings, up to around noontime, just to see what's going to happen. Usually after noontime, it kind of falls off a little bit after noontime. But later in the afternoon, up around 4 o'clock, we can get another opening back into Europe for about a couple of hours. So a couple of times during the day you need to be looking is in the mornings and again late in the evenings. Now I have seen times when it just shoots right on through noontime and goes most of the afternoon. So it's hard to predict because these E-clouds are just forming up in little spots. You may have a guy 15 miles away from you that's just working stuff like crazy and you can't hear any of it. It's because that E-cloud just happens to be in the right place for him. And then, of course, vice versa, you could be doing the same thing. He doesn't hear anything. So you just have to.
That's why I hear you working all these people that I don't hear.
Now you know.
Okay, now, this is a really strange mode. Only occurs, I think, more into early June to maybe late July. It's called summer Soltis propagation. And it goes mainly to Japan. It's from here to Japan with not a whole lot going on in between. You can see the stations I've worked here, and there's nothing but Japanese there. I did work once a KL7, but normally you don't hear them. You normally it just seems to go somehow in some kind of ducting, all the way to Japan. So, and it's not every night. We may get, several nights of it. So you just have to be ready for it. Since we've gotten FT8, we hear it a lot more often than we used to when we just had CW. And over the years, I've worked, I think, about 275, I've had 275 JAQSOs on 6. So if you want to work Japan, that's the time you gotta be there.
What time of the day or night?
Okay, I'm sorry, I forgot to say that. That's normally the late evening, starting up around 2200, running up to about 02, with in between those numbers, the more the peak. It used to be more after 2200, but on FT8, I've seen them come in as early as 2100.
Are you talking about local time or?
The GMT,
Okay.
GMT. So late afternoon for those guys, because it's kind of sunrise over on their side.
And Mike, most of your QSOs are on CW?
Back before we had FT8. Yeah, those 275, I'd say probably 75% of those were on CW. Now, they're weak. I mean, I won't tell you that, you just sit back in an armchair copy. These signals will really, really be down in the mud for you. And it's going to take a pretty decent antenna, but I've known guys, you work some JAs with what, 5 or 7 element or?
No, 5.
5 element. So, and power helps too. Power helps too.
And no power at the time. I mean, no big power at the time.
Right. So, and of course, there's certain days it'll be better than others, but FT8 is going to give you a bigger advantage to try to work Japan. Okay, one more. Good. Okay. All right. Now this is when you get into the mad dog stage. This is when you've run out of other things to do, and you want to throw a bunch of money into a hole. This is EME, which is Earth, Moon, Earth. And you could see some of the nice juicy stuff on here, like JT5DX on 6 meters, FW5, E51, V6. The one thing about EME, it takes a pretty high gain antenna, and it takes a real low noise QTH. That's probably the biggest factor. If you don't have a low noise QTH, then I wouldn't bother trying to put anything up or even trying, because you're just not going to hear the signals. They're going to be so weak. You might be able to get them to hear you, but you're not going to hear them. But you're going to work stations on EME, you'll never work on terrestrial. I mean, it wouldn't matter how old you live to be, you would never work, in my belief, you'd never work JT5 or T8 or some of those on terrestrial type 6 meters, unless the flux just went through the roof for some strange reason. But there's unfortunately a lot of money involved in trying to get up an array enough to make it worthwhile working EME. Signals are extremely weak. They use a mode called JT65. It's something akin to FT8, but it has a longer sequence time. It's normally a 45-second sequence.
Mike, other than the magical antenna that you need for that, and the fact that you need a low noise QTH, other than that, this is pretty independent of normal propagation, anything to do with propagation.
Right. Well, there are a few factors. If we have, say we're getting a lot of good E-skip here, which means the E layer is ionized, then we're not going to be able to get to the moon. We're going to end up hitting the E layer and
Bouncing off.
so what you need is kind of the worst conditions you can get on 6. And of course, you can do EME almost every day, not every day, because it depends on the distance of the moon to us and things like that. There are a lot of factors, and there's a lot of programs that will say, okay, today is going to be a great day for EME, or it's going to be a poor day. So you know whether it's worth even trying, whether it's worth getting out of bed for to even try.
So Mike, why don't you tell everybody how much it probably would cost to get up a competitive array?
Well, yeah, unfortunately, if you saw that array in the very beginning, which was 4 6M7s, by the time you get the tower and all the antennas, you're probably looking at probably $20,000 by the time you get off the ground. Now, that's not to say, I'm going to show you later, you're going to see some what I call bare bones EME antennas. This is where everything is Armstrong. There's no rotator, there's no elevation rotator, because you got to have elevation and you got to have azimuth. And when you go to buy an elevation rotator, you're going to spend $3,000 right there on that, and then another $3,000 on the azimuth, to turn something big enough. So it just gets crazy, after a while. But I have seen guys with very little antenna, and it had to do with their location. They were in a real low noise location. And they did well without any elevation. What happens is, with your antenna with no elevation looking out, when the moon comes up over the horizon, you've got about an hour or so where you can actually try and establish a contact. Because if you think about your lobes on an antenna, how you've got 1 or 2 or 3 lobes there, as the moon moves through those, you can get a pretty decent signal off of it. Plus, you get what they call ground gain, which can be 3 to 6 dB by keeping your antenna not elevated. So I've seen guys, I know KX4R, some of you may know him, he's worked a bunch of stuff with no elevation, 7-element Yagi, but he's in an excellent location, extremely quiet. He's on the side of a mountain where he has a backdrop behind him, and he's worked some pretty darn good stuff with that setup. But again, low noise and just in a real good location. If you're near the ocean, there's another good location. A lot of these guys that go on expeditions to some of these islands, like E51 and FW5. This guy's antenna here, I saw the pictures of it. You could do like this, and it was just a horizontal antenna. It was just nothing off the ground. But he's on an island with nothing but salt water and probably a water table right under him there. So things like that will kind of enhance your signals for EME. We've gotten off track because another thing I did mention here, going to the moon, they say that the amount of power returned is possibly somewhere around 7%. So when you leave here and get there, only 7 of what you've sent is going to be possibly coming back. And because you have to imagine when your beam leaves here, by the time it gets to the moon, it's out here. It may have started off here, but then it's out here. So your signal is spread out over a large expanse. So there's very little reaching the moon, and the moon's not a good reflector. It's more like a big piece of rock out there you're trying to get signals to bounce off of. Yeah. Okay, this one is kind of important, I think, because this is four times of the year. We have here what we call our summer solstice, where the sun has reached its highest point, and that's centered around June the 21st. So everything we worked is going to be one side or the other around June the 21st, both E-skip and this summertime, solstice summertime propagation. Another couple of times was during the equinox, the spring and fall equinox, you could possibly get some TEP. That's at this time period where we're at right now. I don't recall that we had any last year. We could have had it and I missed it, but you just don't know when it might happen. So then we get into the winter solstice, which is around December the 21st. And I've never seen any DX. There is some stateside propagation. They actually have a 6-meter contest, I think during January. Now, if we did have enough flux for F layer, this is when we would do that. Right here around this December 21st, because I can remember working from November through December into January on F2. But I just don't believe we're going to see it again. I mean, it'd be great if we could, because with that, pretty small stations can really do well. I had a friend that had, can't remember, I think it was 4 elements in his attic with no amplifier, and he worked the Vatican on 6-meter CW. So that's kind of an example. I can remember working guys in Greenland using these there's a little radio by Oncom about so wide, and the antenna had a whip on it. And he was sitting in his shack with that whip pulled up. I was talking to him on sideband. So when the band is open on F2, I mean, it's incredible. It's like the greatest day on 10 meters that you've ever seen. And it's too bad we can't see it again, but that's kind of the way it goes. So let's move up one here. So this is a location I have, a farm location. It's 2 9-element Yankees that are stacked. But you don't have to go to this degree, but I will brag on these. These are M-square 9-element Yankees. Those are great antennas. But you don't have to worry a lot about height. You know, you're like, well, I don't have a very tall tower, or I don't have any way to get the antenna very high. If you can get somewhere between 20 and 40 feet, you know, that's easily. Last year I'm able to raise my antenna up and down. So last year I had it at 40 feet. Worked one of the best DXs I've ever worked on terrestrial. Worked a guy in the Philippines, and it was one of those magic type things. He couldn't believe it. He was all jumping up and down when we had in fact, he worked 3 people in Atlanta. He worked 9 stations in the U.S. that night. 3 here in Atlanta, some up in the Midwest. But the height, you know, if you get it up 30, 40 feet, you know, I think you're going to be fine.
Mike, is there a possibility of being too high up for 6
Okay,
meters?
glad you brought that up. My first antenna on 6, my antenna, I didn't have a place to put a 6-meter antenna, but I wanted one really bad. And my top antenna was like at 100 and something on HF. So I mounted it like at 115 feet. And I probably used it for, I don't know, 10 years. In fact, it's still there. One of them, I still have an antenna up there at 115. So a lot of the, what I would say, gurus on 6 claim that, you know, that's just too high for E-skip, but I have worked a lot of stuff with that, a lot of stuff, especially during F2. Now, during F2, I would say the higher antenna is going to open the band and probably close the band, while the band's really open, then the lower antennas are gonna work okay too. But for E-skip, if you just can't put it anywhere else, on your antenna, I wouldn't worry about it, you're gonna be fine. But if you've gotta put up something to get the antenna on it, put it down at, something lower. Let's see.
What's the spacing on those?
35 feet.
Between them?
Yeah, let's see, maybe it's 30. There's one's at 95, one's at 65, so that'd be 30 feet, 30-foot spacing. And I kind of had to do that because of the way I had to mount this one. This one is on a side mount, and I had to get down low enough to get under these guy wires, because these are 50-foot booms here. So I had to accentuate the guy wires, and I just barely cleared it. In fact, I had to let this boom sag just a little bit because it kept catching one of the guy wires out there. But I wouldn't stack any antennas until you've got the longest boom you could possibly turn with a single antenna. Let's see what we got here. And coax is definitely a consideration here also. Depending on how close you are to the antenna. If you're less than 100 feet, some type of LMR 400, something in that range is probably okay. Half-inch hardline, of course, a little bit better. But once you get out to 200 feet, you better be looking at some 7/8, and if it's beyond 200, then you need 1.25 inch, 5/8 heliax. Because why have a great antenna out there, but you're losing a big portion of your signal on the way back? On EME, you're looking for just tenths of a dB. I mean, you're trying to save every little ounce that you can of received signal getting back to the receiver. And that goes to say for your transmit power, but you can kind of make up for that a little bit. But received signal, it's hard to get it back. There's a lot of different 6-meter antennas on the market. This is a homebrew antenna by YU7EF. He has a lot of designs if you decide, hey, I want to build something. There's some companies that sell these little mounting pods here for putting your elements on. So you can buy a lot of the hardware to build it up with. He gives you all the dimensions. You just got to buy the aluminum.
That doesn't go through the.
No, I think it's mounted on top of a little.
Like a saddle?
Device. Yeah, I've seen these saddles at Dayton in the boneyards. People make them up and sell them, and I think they're on the internet also. You can find them. If you got a step IR, you already got a 6-meter antenna, but it's nice to add the. They have some little elements you can add in between to kind of help it.
If you've been on 6 around here, that's what Peter, W4IMD.
Is that right? I think I've heard him talk about that, yeah. They're relatively, if you kind of like building antennas or building stuff, it's pretty straightforward. And that's a pretty high gain antenna. You're looking at 13.15 dBi. That's about a 30-foot boom. That would probably be something akin to a 6M7 JHV by M square, which is it's a 7 element, and this one's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Well, it's actually 8. They have kind of a special setup here on the driven element for these things. So move up one here. Okay, now for you guys that want to try EME and you want to do it on the cheap, this is what you do. You notice this guy is strictly, everything is Armstrong. I don't know if you can see it, but he's got some ropes here on the end that he ties it down and lets it elevate or not elevate. So this is, you don't have to be high off the ground here. That's not a problem. You don't have to worry about keeping it dead on the moon. You can get off 10 or 15 degrees in azimuth elevation and you're still okay because your signal is like this when it gets to the moon. But But you look at one thing, you notice there's an insulating element here. That's to keep this center boom from trying to detune the antennas. What you see guys do quite often is use vertical elements on the antennas. They take and turn these vertical. Move it up one more here. Okay, that's what this guy did here. He's got a couple of them that he made vertical. And he does really, really well, but according to what I'm told, you lose what's called your ground gain that I talked about earlier. When you're down on the horizon with the vertical elements, they say that you don't get that ground gain. And 3 to 6 dB is pretty considerable to lose sometimes. The only other problem with being down with no elevation is you pick up all kinds of noise in the neighborhood and all the noises around you, so you don't hear quite as well when you're down that low. Okay, now we'll get around to operating a little bit. There's quite a number of tools for trying to figure out who's where, what's exactly going on. This is a place called DX Maps, and it's just showing some of the stations that, like KP4 over to, it looks like SP7 or something like that. So at a quick glance, you kind of tell, or do we have any propagation to Europe? In this particular instance, no, we don't have anything. But you can watch that guy and move on up to one more there. Now, this was a particular day, just to show you a really unbelievable day on 6 meters. This was late in the afternoon. We had propagation to Europe and to Japan at the same time, which that's pretty unusual. This was late in the afternoon. I'm guessing, I don't know if it tells me up there, but probably around 6 o'clock in the afternoon, something like that. So you can see the number of signals coming, and you look at where they're coming into. They're coming right over here into Southeast. Quite often, these SSSP signals will jump over the poor California guys out here that have it so easy in Japan. Now, there'll be other nights where they're hearing them and we don't, but it's quite often, it just jumps over everybody and just comes right in here. And you'll notice from Europe, it's also jumping down in here. So some days we're lucky, other days it's all up in the Northeast. And I've seen times when Europe would jump over everything in the U.S. and go to California. We'd be down here hearing nothing, and the guys in California are working Europe. Bring it up one more here. Okay, now this is probably the most helpful tool that I've ever come across. It's called PSK Reporter. And what it does, you can be a reporter, but if you're on a digital mode, they also have it for CW, I'll mention that in a minute. But what happens is you go on the PSK Reporter and you put your call in there, and it comes back and say you transmit call CQ, things like that. It will come back and tell you exactly who's hearing you. Like, I clicked on this guy over here, and it said EA8 in the Canary Islands, and it gives the grid, how far it is, and it tells you, how strong you might be. It gives you a dB reading. So if you get on in the morning and you're saying, well, I wonder where propagation's at, you just call CQ, and if you point your beam to Europe to see, by opening it up in Europe, you'll start seeing little red blobs like this, saying 7 minutes ago, I heard you -16 and that type of thing. So when you start seeing that, you know the band's open, you might as well start calling, just keep calling CQ.
And that's all automated, so.
That's all automated. Within, if you're using WSJT or JTDX, either one, there's a box in there you can check. It's under settings, I don't remember exactly where, but it says, I want to be a PSK reporter. So what that means is every time you hear somebody on your radio, if you've got it hooked up to the computer and so forth, it will send that information back, and the guy in Europe or whoever you're reporting can see that, hey, I'm making it to Harry's QTH or wherever. So it's a very handy tool, extremely handy tool. There's one for CW called RBN, Reverse Beacon Network. If you ever want to see how strong you are on CW, and you can do this on any band, it doesn't have to be 6. And the same thing for this guy. You can do it on 20 meters or 15. You just tell it which band or all bands or what bands you want to get reports on. But on the RBN, if you get on, instead of 20 meters, you call CQ and you're watching the RBN network, he will report you and say, you were this strong, sending so many words per minute. And I've done this with guys who wanted to compare our antennas and just see, you know, is my antenna better than your antenna type thing. You get on there and he calls CQ and we get the RBN. I call CQ and we get the reading. So it feeds back, you know, who's doing the best at that time.
And the last thing you said to me is the most interesting, because I have a friend that lives across the valley from me, so we get on at the same time and just do that. In fact, you don't even have to send CQ, you send test.
Right.
And on CW, and then we'll both be spotted automatically, and we both get a dB reading in
Right.
the whole bit.
Right, right.
So we can check it by direction too, because you can see in many cases, I'll be stronger in one direction on a wire antenna.
Right.
And he will be stronger in another, both of us using basically a wire antenna, pretty much oriented the same.
Yeah.
There's a lot of data there is all I'm
Oh,
saying. It's
yeah,
a good
there's a
thing.
lot of things to analyze, because, you know, you might try it later in the day, and maybe, you know, he was weaker, but now he's stronger, so it's just some interesting tools. I'd highly recommend PSK Reporter on 6 meters, because you can, you know, kind of see, you know, what's going on out there. Let's see, bring us up one more here. I've been ad-libbing more than following my script here, but there's a chat room, which I would highly recommend. You don't have to do any chatting, you can just go and monitor. But what goes on here is called the 50 megahertz IARU Region 2 chat room. And remember this called ON4KST. He has probably 10 or 12 different chat rooms, some for low band 160. If you work 160, it's great to watch low band chat. This Region 2 is talks more about, you know, people here in the U.S. There's another one for more for the Europeans, and you could go over there and watch what they're doing, or actually try and talk to the guys, because you can look and see who is logged in. It's not quite on the screen here, but there's a tab over there that shows all the stations that are actually monitoring. So you could come on here and say you wanted to work some grid you saw out there. You come on and there's a way to send him a message. It'll show up here. It'll pop up on his end. Now whether he replies or not, it's hard to say, but you can say, hey, can you meet me on a certain frequency or something like that. So a lot of the guys just send, you know, data back and forth here. So it's kind of handy just to see what's going on. Plus there's a map you can overlay to kind of see, you know, what's being worked.
That one, I think is really, really handy, because for 6 meters, you'll get a guy that says, I'm currently on
Right.
50110,
Right.
calling CQ. So it's live, it's not delayed.
Right.
He tells you he's calling CQ, so it's a good test. You tune to that frequency, you either hear him or you don't.
Right. What happens also is a lot of times these guys are somewhat protective of what's going on. When a guy comes here and says, I'm on like 5110, you don't see it come out on the packet
I'll look
cluster.
you over now.
You know, it's just, you know, you had to be here to know that that was going on. And maybe by the time somebody does put it on the cluster, you know, the pileup's so big, you know, you'd never make it through. So that's another handy tool.
What was the?
Okay, go to ON4KST first.
I'm sorry.
ON4 Kilo Sugar Tango.
That's all you need to know, because you Google, you know, you'll get there.
Right, and once you get there, you're gonna see a bunch of different chat rooms, but.
Yeah, you see that up there, on4kst.org.
Oh, okay, yeah.
The one you want is that 50 megahertz IAR region 2.
Right. And that's for 6 meters. Now, if you work 160, they've got one that's called low band, and the whole world is on that one. Okay, let's move up one more here. This is kind of my home setup here, and everybody has their own idea on what rig they want. And I would say all of them are good if it's got 6 meters on it. A lot of them need preamps. You know, that's something you might want to look into. Sherwood has a good website. I don't know if most of you are interested in Sherwood Engineering that rates radios receiver-wise.
Mike?
Yeah, and he's got about 100 different radios on there. This doesn't mean that, you know, hey, this one's way better than that one, but it does give you some numbers to look at, kind of compare and decide, okay, maybe if I buy a new radio, I might want to look at that particular one. And let's move on to, next. Okay, now to amplifiers. Now, I know a lot of guys use 100 watts, that's great, but it just depends on how fast you want to get to 100. You know, how old are you? How long have you got to get to 100? So if you want to kind of move things up a notch, I would highly recommend some kind of amp. This is one, some of you may remember, I know Bill recognizes this guy. When Channel 2 went from analog to digital, they had to get rid of all the digital transmitter. And it had 50 1 kilowatt units in their transmitter. May have had a few more, but around 50. So they gave these units right here, which is a 1 kilowatt transistorized block, gave them away to different hams that wanted them. And basically, it was ready to go in some sense. You had to put some fans on top of it for cooling. You had to come up with a 48 volt power supply, which you could find these things for less than $50 brand new. And you needed a TR relay and I think it was a high pass filter.
Yeah, you had
Is it high pass?
POICE.
Yeah. Anyway, you had to put the third harmonic was really bad out of this thing, so you had to kind of chop it off. But anyway, I use one of those at the farm quite a bit. You get a good solid kilowatt. You might see one floating around. Problem is, I wouldn't spend a lot of money on it because if you ever lose some of these transistors, nobody's been able to find a substitute. You might have to go to the manufacturer to find that, which would be a pretty good cost. So
Mike,
if you get one cheap.
I have one of those in case anybody's interested.
Okay. Yeah.
And one of the things that he mentioned, the 48 volt supply, that's at something like 75 amps, if I remember.
Yeah, I can't remember the exact amperage.
It's over 50
I
amps.
think it's right at 50. I think it's around 50.
I've got a brand new one I'll sell for what it cost me, which was $27 if you find one of these things. You can do it.
So,
I'm
and
not
these are,
pushing it, but I mean, it's
Yeah.
brand new.
yeah, exactly.
plastic.
These are switching power supplies. So they're like 48 volts at 50 amps or 60 amps, something along that. The first, before I had the transistorized one, I've gone through several amps, but I wanted something, and I just didn't have the money to put in a 6 meter amp. I found an SB220, and it was pretty extensive. It was pretty extensive mod. I've seen some mods they've shown for converting these to 6, and really poorly done. That is really not doing the job. But if you really want to do it right, you have to tear the tank circuit out and, you know, just go through the whole thing. But I used this thing for many years. It would easily do 800 watts, and on a good day you might could push it up to a kilowatt. But yes, sir.
And there's still available W1 Queen Juliet Louis up in Danbury, Connecticut is still pushing those. He
Right.
does the modification on them, and the guy is a superb technician.
Right. I think they call them King amps. Is he the one that does King?
King Creations.
I'm sorry?
King Creations.
Yeah.
In my shack in Danbury, I had Louis amps. The deal we had worked was I was on 6, he wasn't interested in 6. He planted them in my shack. I would advertise them on the
Oh,
airport,
okay.
and we had a thing going for a couple of years.
Right.
Go on eBay, because he has them listed on eBay.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think he modifies the SB 200.
No, 220s, he hates the 200.
Well, I know, but I have seen 200s that I think King or whoever, of course, less power. This particular one, N4PN, has this particular one right now. I sold it to him. Okay. Because what you're going to find is going to happen is on 6 meters, there's times when you hear a signal and you've maybe got 1 minute. If you're lucky, you may have a 1 minute opening there. And if you can't complete the contact during that time, he doesn't hear you or something, then it's gone. So you want to go in, with your full hand of cards, so to speak. You don't want to hold anything back. So, you may hear him again, and you may never, ever hear him again. Because I've workstations, I heard him one time, briefly, I worked it, it's over with. I've never heard him again. So you got to be ready, with whatever mode, with everything you got ready to go.
Yeah, this is another one too, because somebody said a while ago about hearing you work them and they can't hear them. Mike doesn't live that far from me, and I've heard him work a station. I couldn't hear the station at all, but I hung in there, and in 10 minutes, I hear him, and he doesn't hear him more than
Right,
likely.
right.
We didn't talk about that, but it's just like a flashlight shining around. Boy,
Yeah.
you know that somebody anywhere in your area is hearing it. Don't take it that you don't have the capability to get there.
And that brings up another thing. A lot of times, don't call blind. A lot of times guys will see somebody spotted, they go to that frequency and they start calling. And there might be a guy across town that's actually hearing them. So, and you're out of sequence, you don't know if the guy's transmitting or, what he's doing. So if you can't hear him, don't just start calling him. Now if you hear him and, then he goes away, go ahead and call, but because he might come back in. But, at least hear him, once or twice before you start calling. So now we're getting down to modes. What mode should you be on? Prior to just the last year or so, CW was my primary DX mode, with sideband being second. And then we moved over to what was called JT65, and we stayed there for a short time. And everybody was complaining, oh, this takes too long, the sequences are too long. So finally, they came up with FT8, which is a lot shorter, not quite as sensitive, but a little bit shorter. This is actually a JT65 screen. I don't know, most of you probably have some experience with FT8 or JT65. But this is what you've got is you're on one frequency and you're seeing all the signals up here and they're being decoded on the side here. You call the guy you want to hear there. So I'm not going to get into how to operate FT8 and things like that. I'm just saying I would really look into it if you're not into it. Now, for some guys will say, well, I had that tonight. Who was it that gave me a hard time about FT8?
Hey, Mike.
Oh, was it you? Okay. And some guy says, oh, that's not radio. That's my computer and your computer. Well, you take it like it is. If you don't like it, that's fine. You can stay down on CW.
Robot radio.
Yeah. I got hooked on FT8. I mean, I love it because I like to work DX, and when I saw all this stuff was just rolling out, I'm like, I gotta work that because I was a down-in-the-wool CW guy. I'm a real CW guy, but these days, like K4.